Until now, nobody has talked about the Irish slaves who were among the first ones to be brought to the Americas. Just a few years before the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, European colonizers had Irish slaves for hard labor work. They were brought to European colonies and made to work under harsh conditions. However, this is never told about in history books. After all, it's less appealing for people to believe that one European power enslaved Europeans. But who was the one responsible for enslaving the Irish people, and why did it do so? Why did the Irish have to face this treatment, and why was it normal to enslave them? Welcome to a new episode of Uncovering Untold Stories, a channel where we talk about the secret and hidden historical stories, events and incidents of the past that find their roots in either religious or history books. It's a place where you will hear the most unorthodox and hard-to-believe stories that have been forgotten but are part of history, shaping our lives to this day. In this episode, we will tell you the hidden truths about the Irish, who were the first slaves brought to the Americas. Let's get started. To this date, most people believe that the Irish were never enslaved. Rather, they were indentured servants. It's thought that the narrative of Irish slavery is presented to create victimhood for white Europeans and to tell that they were also enslaved, probably to downplay the severity of the transatlantic slave trade. However, before any opinion is built, knowing all sides of the story is important. Also, it should be known that slavery of one nation cannot and does not downplay slavery of another nation. Things indeed began with indentured servants, but it brutally turned into slavery, which not most people know about. This was especially prevalent in the 17th century, before the Act of Union in 1707, when many Irish individuals endured conditions that closely resembled slavery. Indentured servitude involved individuals signing contracts to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the Americas, along with food and shelter. Upon completing their term, they typically received freedom dues, such as land or money. While some willingly entered into these agreements, a significant number of Irish people were forcibly transported and sold into servitude. This group included political prisoners, vagrants, convicts, political activists, thieves, prostitutes, and others deemed undesirable by the English government. Although labeled as indentured servants, their circumstances were involuntary and closely mirrored slavery. Not only that, but the Irish indentured servants were taken on the excuse of being used as servants, but once they reached the Americas, they were sold as slaves. But let's go back in history to understand how it began. The Irish experience with slavery dates back to Viking raids, starting in 795. Vikings conducted brutal attacks on Irish coastal communities, killing many and capturing others as slaves. These raids continued through the mid-9th century, primarily targeting northern and eastern coastal regions with hit-and-run tactics. The Vikings plundered these areas, taking treasures and captives back to their holdings in Scotland or Norway. While some valuable captives were ransomed back to their families, many others remained in captivity. From 837 onward, Viking raids intensified, targeting larger monastic towns such as Armagh, Glendalough, Kildare, Slane, Clonard, Clonmacnoise, and Lismore. These significant attacks led to the capture and enslavement of many Irish people, who were primarily taken to Scotland and Iceland. In 875, a notable event occurred when Irish slaves in Iceland launched Europe's largest slave rebellion since the fall of the Roman Empire, killing their master and fleeing to the Vestmannaeyjar Islands. In 841, Vikings took control of the port that became known as Dublin. By 853, Dublin had transformed into a significant trading center, with the slave trade playing a central role in its economy. Despite the death of Ivar the Boneless in 873, the slave trade in Dublin continued. Although the Vikings were driven out of Dublin in 902 by the combined forces of Brega and Leinster, they returned in 914 and reclaimed their territory, capturing more Irish slaves in the process. Irish resistance to Viking rule was persistent. In 980, the Irish, led by Mael Secnail MacDomnail, king of Meath, fought and defeated the Vikings, managing to free their enslaved countrymen. This victory marked a significant turning point in the struggle against Viking oppression. As time passed, some Vikings who remained in Ireland embraced Christianity and gradually became part of Irish society. these Norse settlers began to integrate, marrying into Irish families and adopting local customs. Their assimilation contributed to a decline in Viking influence and a reduction in raiding activities in the region. A decisive moment in ending Viking dominance in Ireland occurred in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf. Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, led an army to attack Dublin, supported by his allies, including the Limerick Vikings. They faced a coalition of Irish forces allied with the local Vikings in Dublin. Brian Boru's forces emerged victorious, and all the slaves held by the Vikings were freed. This battle marked the end of regular Norse raids by both Danes and Norwegians. The forced enslavement and severity of Viking raids declined significantly after the Norman invasion of England in October 1066. With the establishment of Norman rule, new dynamics emerged in Ireland. The Normans were keen to expand their influence, and slavery in its traditional form was abolished in 1102. In 1155, Pope Adrian IV purportedly issued a papal bull granting Henry II of England the authority to invade Ireland. This document, known as Laudabilitaire, has been a subject of historical debate, with some historians suggesting it might have been a forgery. Regardless, Henry II faced significant pressure, including the threat of excommunication for the murder of Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This situation might have influenced the Pope's decision. Eventually, Pope Alexander III officially granted the lands of Ireland to Henry II, even though it was not within his right to do so. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos about little heard and untold real historical stories. Let's continue now. The Norman conquest of Ireland began when Dermot MacMurrough, the deposed King of Leinster, sought assistance to regain his throne. MacMurrough, sometimes referred to as Dermot of the Foreigners, was a descendant of Brian Boru. In October 1171, King Henry II landed in Ireland, allowing Dermot to recruit soldiers and mercenaries from among the Normans. Upon their arrival, the Normans captured Dublin and the surrounding area, establishing a zone of control known as the Pale. This term came to signify the safe and secure area under Norman rule, beyond which lay the unpredictable and often hostile territories. The expression, "going beyond the pale," originated from this context, denoting actions considered unwise or risky. Although the Normans abolished slavery in Ireland, they did not eliminate serfdom, which persisted for several hundred years. Serfs were bound to the land they worked on and were subject to the authority of the landowners. Unlike slaves, serfs could not be sold separately from the land. In other words, a person buying land would get the serfs working on it with it. This system ensured that agricultural labor was consistently available, maintaining the essential farming activities that supported the economy. The Battle of Kinsale in 1601 was a turning point in Irish history. The defeat of the Irish and their Spanish allies by the English marked the end of the Gaelic aristocracy's dominance. Following this loss, many Irish nobles fled to Europe in what is known as the Flight of the Earls, leaving a power vacuum that English nobles and settlers quickly filled. The common people, however, remained in Ireland, facing a new era under English rule. The exact number of Irish and Spanish soldiers captured after the battle is debated. Some reports suggest that English forces captured around 30,000 soldiers, while other sources claim the number was closer to 15,000, with 7,000 to 8,000 taken prisoner. The Spanish soldiers were eventually allowed to return home, but the Irish captives were not so fortunate. Shortly after King James I ascended to the throne in 1603 or 1604, he reportedly issued the Order of Banishment. This decree allowed the sale of captured Irish soldiers as slaves, effectively exiling them from Ireland permanently. This is an unchanged and unarguable part of history. Nearly a decade after this decree, King James I granted permission for the English Governor-General to collect and sell these captured Irish soldiers as slaves, sending them to the New World in the Americas. In 1612, the first recorded Irish slaves were sold, possibly to the Portuguese, who took them to their colony in the Amazon River Basin in modern-day Brazil. This marked the beginning of the forced transportation of Irish people to the New World. There has been debate over whether these individuals were indentured servants or slaves, but it is evident that they were forcibly removed from Ireland, making the assumption that they went voluntarily illogical. Thus, their status as slaves is more accurate. In 1625, Charles III, the son of James I, issued a decree that continued and possibly expanded upon his father's policies. This decree authorized the sale of Irish prisoners, common criminals, and political agitators to English plantation owners in the North American colonies. As a result, tens of thousands of Irish men and women were transported to the Eastern American colonies, as well as to Guyana, Antigua, Montserrat, and other Caribbean locations between 1629 and 1632. The exact number of Irish people sent to these colonies may never be known, but by 1637, approximately 69% of the population of Montserrat was Irish. While many of these individuals were indentured servants, some were indeed slaves. The economic rationale behind the use of Irish slaves was straightforward. Black slaves had to be purchased for a significant sum, ranging from 20 to 50 pounds sterling, a considerable amount of money at the time. In contrast, Irish slaves were sold for 900 pounds of cotton per person, and were also traded for tobacco and indigo in a direct barter system. This made Irish slaves a more cost-effective option for English plantation owners, who needed cheap labor to cultivate their crops in the colonies. During the 17th century, the Irish became one of the largest sources of slaves for English traders and plantation owners, even surpassing the African slave trade until the early to mid-1700s. This dark chapter began with the Irish Rebellion in 1641 and continued through 1652. Over this period, it's reported that English forces killed more than 550,000 Irish people. In addition, around 300,000, mostly military-aged men, were sold into slavery. The Irish children, particularly girls, were also captured and sold, often for their value in domestic service roles. By 1650, nearly 29,000 Irish individuals had been sold to planters. Throughout the 1650s, though the exact numbers are disputed, it's claimed that about 100,000 Irish children, aged 10 to 14, were taken from their families and sold into slavery in the West Indies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and New England. By the end of the decade, it is said that Irish slaves outnumbered the colonists in many areas. In 1652, Cromwell issued an order for 12,000 Irish to be sold to Barbados. On May 1, 1654, Cromwell furthered his policies with the To Hell or to Connaught Proclamation. This decree marked the beginning of the English confiscation of Irish lands and the forced relocation of the native Irish to the western regions beyond the Shannon River. Those who resisted were either executed or sent to the West Indies as slaves. Cromwell's proclamation stated, "Those who failed to transplant themselves into Connaught or County Clare within 6 months shall be attainted of high treason or be sent to America or other parts beyond the seas. Those banished who return ought to suffer the pains of death as felons by virtue of this act without benefit of clergy." While this decree allowed the English to kill the Irish without consequence, selling them was far more profitable. It is claimed that over 80,000 more Irish were sold, with 52,000 going to Barbados and Virginia. Cromwell's campaign of terror and forced relocation had lasting effects on Ireland and its people. The mass enslavement and displacement of the Irish led to the depopulation of large areas, paving the way for English settlers and drastically altering Ireland's social and economic landscape. The suffering endured during this period highlights the harsh realities of colonial exploitation and the ruthless pursuit of profit. The forced transportation of Irish people to the New World played a significant role in the development of the American colonies. Despite the harsh conditions and exploitation they faced, Irish labor contributed crucially to the growth of these colonies. The intertwined histories of Ireland and America during this time are marked by tragedy and the resilience of the Irish people. The debate over whether the deported Irish were slaves or indentured servants remains significant. Given the historical context and the use of barter systems involving goods like tobacco and cotton in exchange for Irish labor, it's reasonable to argue that many of these deported Irish were indeed slaves. In 1656, the Council of State issued an order to capture and send 1,000 Irish girls and 1,000 Irish boys, many as young as their early teens, to Jamaican planters. The exact numbers are debated, but these figures seem credible considering the children were likely the offspring of those already deported. This action was part of a larger pattern of exploitation, highlighted by an edict from October 2, 1665, which addressed the transportation of Irish individuals from Long Island to Jamaica. The edict clarified that these people were not indentured servants, but forcibly removed Irish already residing in New York. The conditions faced by the Irish slaves are also less known. The authorities of that time were anxious about the slaves, and this can be found in a document from November 18, 1656. Addressed to Captain Wilkinson, this Whitehall communication stressed the strategic importance of the Somers Islands and warned of potential Spanish interest in the area. It also noted lingering discontent among some inhabitants, which was seen as a possible threat. The document urged Captain Wilkinson to remain vigilant and monitor any discontented individuals, reflecting a fear of rebellion. This anxiety suggests that the forcibly removed Irish, subjected to harsh conditions, were likely in a state of subjugation that could provoke unrest. The reports indicate that the authorities feared the Irish might resist their treatment. Such fears would be less likely if the Irish were merely indentured servants, as indentured servitude typically involved contracts with specific terms. However, the language and conditions described point more toward slavery. The Irish were forcibly removed from their homeland and subjected to severe hardships, which aligns more closely with the conditions of slavery than indentured servitude. What do you think? Should Irish slavery be taught in the same way as the transatlantic slave trade is? Did you know about the fact that the Irish were enslaved and brought to the Americas as first slaves? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on whether the modern Irish people should never forget about this dark part of history and know who did it to them. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on stories that might sound controversial, mysterious, and shocking, but are real and have roots in religious and history books. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.